Well, hello, and welcome to lecture week number 13. This week we'll look at religion in America in the 1960s, and perhaps no decade is so immortalized in American memory as the 60s, couched in the colorful rhetoric of peace and love, images of the civil rights movement, and fondly remembered for its music, art, and activism. The decade brought many people hope for a more inclusive, forward thinking nation. But the decade was also plagued by strife, tragedy, and chaos. It was the decade of the Vietnam War, inner city riots, and assassinations that seemed to symbolize the crushing of a new generation's idealism. A decade of struggle and disillusionment rocked by social, cultural, and political upheaval. The 1960s are remembered because so much changed and because so much did not. As with many aspects of American society, the 1960s proved a turning point for religious life in America as well. And up until the 1960s, the Protestant establishment, the mainline denominations of Baptists, Congregationalists, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodists, and Presbyterians, had dominated the religious scene, with the occasional Catholic or Jewish voice heard in the background. References to American religion usually meant Protestant Christianity. Traditional Christianity had faced some challenges in the first half of the century, but after the Second Great War, the populace seemed eager to replenish its spiritual wells. At mid-century, Americans streamed back to church in unprecedented numbers. The baby boomers, those born between 1946 and 1965, had begun, and parents of the first baby boomers moved into the suburbs and filled the pews, established church and family as the twin pillars of security and respectability. Religious membership, church funding, institutional building, and traditional faith and practice all increased in the 1950s, as you read last week. At mid-century, things looked very good for Christian America. Over the next decade and a half, however, this peaceful landscape was besieged from many sides. The civil rights movement, the sexual revolution, Vietnam, women's liberation, and new alternative religions such as yoga, transcendental meditation, Buddhism, Hinduism, just to name a few, all challenged the traditional church, its teachings, its leaders, and their actions. In the late 60s and early 70s, religion itself was not rejected so much as was institutionalized Christianity. The church, along with government, big business, and the military, those composing the quote unquote establishment, were denounced by young adults of the 60s for materialism, power ploys, self interest, and smug complacency. However, the 1960s as a revolutionary era has perhaps been a bit exaggerated over the years. Studies show, for example, that while a large vocal minority of mostly middle and upper middle class college students challenged traditional institutions and mores, many of their peers remained as committed to old time moral and religious values as ever. So, this week, you will look at two particular ways in which the struggle over religion at this time was made manifest. And one struggle played out in the American justice system. The landmark Supreme Court decision centered on the place of religion in public education, and particularly the place of Protestantism, which had long been accepted as the given American faith tradition. And these decisions ultimately changed the face of American civil society and in turn helped usher in the last half century of the culture wars. And we'll take a little more in-depth look at the culture wars next week. In his latest book, The Bible, the School, and the Constitution, law professor and constitutional historian Stephen K. Green argues that, quote, the debates over the school question was the closest that Americans have ever come to having a national conversation about the meaning of the religion clauses of the Constitution, unquote. On June 25, 1962, the United States Supreme Court decided that a prayer approved by the New York Board of Regents for use in schools violated the First Amendment by constituting an establishment of religion. The following year, the court disallowed Bible readings in public schools for similar reasons. Now, these cases were often sensationalized by the media and labeled as kicking God out of the public school. Among America's Christian leaders, the response was mixed. Some conservatives, like Billy Graham and Cardinal Francis Spellman, along with the more liberal Episcopal Bishop James A. Pike, voiced opposition to the decisions. Others, including the National Association of Evangelicals, applauded the court for appropriately separating the state from the affairs of the church. Christianity Today, the flagship evangelical magazine at the time, supported the Prayer decision. And so, despite the shock that many American religious leaders expressed over the Supreme Court's actions, these rulings did not come out of nowhere. And you'll spend some time this week looking at some of the cases and some of the arguments made during this time. Another area of struggle, as you know, was in the area of civil rights. And much of the energy and character of the 60s emerged from the civil rights movement, which won its greatest victories in the early years of the decade. The movement itself was changing. Many of the civil rights activists pushing for school desegregation in the 50s were middle class and middle-aged. In the 60s, a new student movement arose whose members wanted swifter changes in the segregated South. And so this led to confrontational protests, marches, boycotts, and sit-ins, and all of this kind of accelerated in the 60s. You'll begin by looking at Black nationalism and Garveyism. So Marcus Garvey, he rose quickly to become the best-known, most controversial, and for millions, the most attractive and compelling of a new generation of Black leaders. Garvey had organized a chapter of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, which functioned as a benevolent fraternal organization. And within a few years of this, in August of 1924, at a UNA convention in August of 1924, Bishop George Alexander McGuire, who was founder of the African Orthodox Church, enunciated the doctrine of a Black God and unveiled the Black Madonna in Liberty Hall. And various different religions proliferated and expanded kind of on the fringes of the Garvey movement, or even arose from within its fold, such as Black Islam and Rastafarianism. So a major part of Garvey's legacy was transplanted into the religious sphere, which is why I'm having you look at some sources to Garvey and Garveyism this week. In the fall of 1961, civil rights activists descended on Albany, a small city in southwest Georgia. And the city was known for entrenched segregation and racial violence, so it seemed an unlikely place for Black Americans to rally and demand change. But the activists there, however, formed the Albany Movement, a coalition of civil rights organizers that included members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, or SNCC, as you may have heard it called before. So the SNCC, the SCLC, and the NAACP members were all in Georgia at that time. But the movement was stymied because the Albany police chief, who launched mass arrests, although he did refuse to engage in police brutality, so he bailed out the leading officials to avoid negative media attention. But it's important to consider this because the Albany movement included elements of a Christian commitment to social justice in its platform. The activists stating that all people were of equal worth in God's family and that no man may discriminate against or exploit another. So in many instances in the 60s, Black Christianity propelled civil rights advocates to action and demonstrated the significance of religion to the broader civil rights movement. And Martin Luther King Jr.'s rise to prominence underscored the role that African American religious figures played in the 60s civil rights movement. Protesters sang hymns and spirituals as they marched. Preachers rallied the people with messages of justice and hope. Churches hosted meetings, prayer vigils, and conferences on nonviolent resistance. The moral thrust of the movement strengthened African American activists and confronted white society by framing segregation as a moral evil. So you'll read King's letter from a Birmingham Birmingham jail, where he articulated his famous line, which I'm sure you've heard: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. You'll also look at Malcolm X, and I'm sure you've heard of Malcolm X. He was a Nation of Islam minister who encouraged African Americans to pursue freedom, equality, and justice by any means necessary. Despite substantial legislative achievements, frustrations with the slow pace of change had grown. And so tensions continued to mount in cities, and the tone of the civil rights movement changed. Activists became less conciliatory in their calls for progress. Many embraced the more militant message of the burgeoning Black Power movement and Malcolm X. So prior to his death in February of 1965, he had emerged as the radical alternative to the racially integrated, largely Protestant approach of Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm Malcolm advocated armed resistance in defense for the safety and well-being of Black Americans, stating, "I don't call it violence when it's self-defense, I call it intelligence." But for his part, King and leaders from more mainstream organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League criticized both Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam for what they perceived to be racial demagoguery. King believed Malcolm X's speech were a great disservice to Black Americans, claiming that they lamented the problems of African Americans without offering solutions. And the differences between King and Malcolm X represented a core ideological tension that would inhabit Black political thought throughout the 60s and the 70s. But African Americans weren't the only Americans struggling to assert themselves in the 60s, as you know. The successes of the civil rights movement and growing grassroots activism inspired countless new movements. And one that we'll look at in your readings this week will be Native Americans. And so in the summer of '61, frustrated Native American university students founded the National Indian Youth Council. And this was to draw attention to the plight of Indigenous Americans. In the Pacific Northwest, the council advocated for tribal fishermen to retain immunity from conservation laws on reservations. And in 1964, they held a series of fish-ins where activists and celebrities cast nets and waited for the police to arrest them. The National Indian Youth Council's militant rhetoric and use of direct action marked the beginning of what was called the Red Power movement. And this was an intertribal movement designed to draw attention to Native issues and to protest discrimination. The American Indian Movement, AIM, and other activists staged dramatic demonstrations, and in November of '69, dozens began a year-and-a-half-long occupation of the abandoned Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. In 1973, hundreds occupied the town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, site of the infamous 1890 Indian Massacre, and they occupied this town for several months. So I've included in your materials this week a link to Harvard University's Pluralism Project, so you can explore what they have to say about Native American religious rights in America. And after Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, Lyndon Johnson vowed to continue his efforts to support civil rights. And Johnson took Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill and pushed it through Congress. In the following summer, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is widely considered to be among the most important pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. And the Comprehensive Act barred segregation in public accommodations and outlawed discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, and national or religious origins. And so I've included a link to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 so that you can go ahead and take a look at that if you haven't already, or refresh your memory if you have looked at that. In 1968, which was a year before New York's Stonewall riots in Southern California, Troy Perry founded one of the world's first church groups with a primary ministry to gays, lesbians, bisexual, and transgender persons. And so you'll read a journal article about the early history of the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches, which is the church that Perry founded. So you'll read a journal article on that. You'll continue reading Matthew Avery Sutton, Jerry Falwell, and the Rise of the Religious Right. If you haven't already started it, I hope you started it, but if not, you need to get reading on that, and also read in your textbook, page 349 to 397. Remember, there are only 2 weeks left in the semester. Please contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.